Indies are the polar opposites of the AAA space in many ways, and this is the appeal of the space for many people. Traditional genres get thrown out the window, there's a heavier focus on stranger narratives, more style over polish, and there's perhaps the most important difference, how much fame they get. Of course, there's the obvious difference with how AAA gets a large spotlight while indies fight for attention, but there's also the difference in how people recognize them. With AAA, it's mostly just the few big studios you're bound to know and have stuck around nearly forever. In AAA, it's a big deal when studios die, and one-hit wonders are almost never seen on this scale. But with indies, it's the polar opposite, as you have studios and developers coming and going left and right. Sure, titles remain famous and successful for long periods of time, but the studios themselves, it's not a guarantee you'll see them back for another hit. One-hit wonders are more so the norm in this space. But despite all that, just like AAA has those rarities with dying studios, indies have their few monolith studios. The ones that everyone recognizes and adores for what they put out, consistently getting people's attention with new releases. Devolver, New Blood, Annapurna, it's more so publishers and developers in this space, but they still pave the way for unique styles and consistent success. But one studio has managed to stand out just fine on their own and become a massive figure in indie gaming despite still being a smaller team and having only a few titles. The studio in question is none other than Supergiant Games. These guys are the definition of quality over quantity, and the indie spirit distilled into a studio. With 4 games to their name, each is given a rich story you wouldn't see in a bigger title, absolutely gorgeous art and music the studio has earned fame for, and the games themselves all managed to hold up as really fun times. And nearly all their games have received universal praise for these factors. Whether it's the smash hit of Bastion that put them on the map, Hades winning most Game of the Year awards when it fully released, and even the much smaller success of Transistor as a cult classic. But there's one title that hasn't gotten this sort of love like the others have. That title in question is Supergiant's third game, Pyre. Pyre is a strange mixture of genres between sports, strategy, and visual novel of all things that follows your exile as you travel across the mysterious downside. You find people who have also been exiled, and now you seek your freedom in the Rites. But as you progress, you realize the sacrifices you may have to make, and the secrets that will catch up to you as the Rites continue. You'll build a team of these exiles to conduct the strange sport of the Rites, focusing which abilities you want them to have while also building your relationships with them and learning more of their stories. Your abilities will decide whether they earn their freedom or the enemy does, and the game won't let you simply try again. In Pyre, you get to live with those consequences, and it makes for a fascinating personalized experience. The game was released without too much fanfare, and like I said before, ended up somewhat forgotten. I heard about games like Bastion and Hades, but never Pyre. That was till I found it as part of a large itch bundle where I also found Science Sojourner, which I previously covered on this channel. After originally brushing it off, I finally realized it was made by Supergiant, and I wondered why I hadn't heard anything about it if their titles were so good. And I'll be honest, I still have no clue, because Pyre absolutely blew me away with how high quality it is. It has all the usual Supergiant strengths, while bringing in some unique factors that made me absolutely fall in love with it. And hopefully by explaining why it hit me so hard, I can get more people to try it and fall in love with it too. But I will warn that Pyre does have a few surprises I'll be spoiling here. Not any specific story details, but there are some parts of the gameplay loop that are much better if you go in blind. So if you're interested, please play before watching this video. You won't regret it. But without further ado, let's uncover Supergiant's hidden gem of Pyre. If there's one thing anyone can tell you about Supergiant as a studio, it's how absolutely gorgeous their games are. This is a studio filled with true artists, and Pyre shows this off magnificently. The game sports Supergiant's usual painterly style for their portraits and environments, though much like their other games, there's a few techniques to make it different and more fitting here. And god, these portraits and backgrounds do not disappoint. They're full of detail and care. Each one feels like it could be a full painting on its own. In no other game has Supergiant gotten to show off their full range of skills and art like they do in Pyre, thanks to the wonderful world it builds up with the downside. The downside is meant to feel strange, alien, harsh, and yet beautiful, and Pyre manages to pull this off perfectly. The downside is filled with the worst environments possible, with barren deserts, toxic swamps, impassable seas, and lava-filled mountains. These locations are filled with the corpses of ancient beings now long dead. The world feels strange to navigate with alien landscapes and land formations. Yet, this also brings out the true beauty, as this mixes wonderfully with the colors that make the downside into something magical. In no other game have I seen the team go this wild with environments. The colors at work here are something else. There's not a moment of this game where the visuals don't absolutely pop. The colors come together like the most beautiful watercolor, and it makes for almost dreamlike landscapes of bright orange sands and rainbow pools going over the oddly shaped terrain. It manages to thread this line with making the downside feel deadly and oppressive, yet also a joy to explore and see every bit of. Just, my goodness, look at these landscapes. It speaks for itself. This goes for the UI as well, as these colors bleed into it, and moreover they capture this strange aesthetic perfectly. A mix between old tomes and the ruins for an ancient ritual. There's not a thing in this game that doesn't feel like it fits the themes and tone perfectly. Everything comes together like a fine tapestry, and makes you feel really immersed in this world. But the world of the downside isn't the only thing Pyre puts its all into, as the characters are equally well designed. Supergiant builds up a strange and truly unique bestiary of fantasy races here, which defy all the usual expectations, from strange slug snake beings, demonic Furbies, and whatever the hell you describe worms as. It adds that overall feeling of magic while also making these characters stand out way more than they usually would. Not to mention adding fun art opportunities with characters like Gilman and Tizo with their expressions. But each design isn't just a neat erase, as they all are handcrafted to portray who they are perfectly, from Gilman's radiant and proud air showing through their armor, yet also their positivity through their expressions, to the moon-touched innocence, suffering, and off-putting nature shown through the beaming smile, messy hair, and strange stare, to literally everything about Ruki. Each gives you a solid idea of who they are before they even say a word. This doesn't just go for the main cast, but every single character in the game, such as Dalbert, Deluge, Ignis, the Lone Minstrel, and god, just look at Manly. I hate this smug bastard so much! That's not even mentioning just the technical skills with these portraits, as while they may be a bit static, they are wonderful in terms of their shading, shapes, and everything to make for a solid portrait I could easily see as its own piece. I do wish they could have a bit more variety with talking sprites, but with how detailed these are, I see why they had to make that sacrifice. But while they may have made sacrifices there, the game as a whole is still incredibly functional, as they pull a clever trick with the main gameplay by combining their stylized backgrounds with 3D models that manage to seamlessly blend in. Supergiant has always been a king at clever visual tricks, but how they managed to combine 2D and 3D stuff like this in Hades always blows my mind. All of it is as smooth as butter, and not distracting at all. You'll barely notice their tricks while playing, and that's a very good thing. Throw in all the incredible visual effects they have going on with these matches, and you have something that's a joy to play while still squeezing every bit of beauty and eye candy out of it. And as if all of this wasn't enough to make this game a treat for the eyes, they had to throw in the Supergiant classic with Daniel Korb's excellent music. Supergiant has always been known for their OSTs, and this game is no different. Daniel Korb once again crafts a wonderful musical aesthetic for this game, where Transistor has its synthetic sounds and Hades has its mix of Greek and metal. Pyre gives off the feeling of an epic fantasy adventure with a mix of lute and other acoustics. The tracks like Downside Ballad instantly set the tone and mood for the game, with how the tracks mix the more traditional sounds with the strangeness of the downside through some synths. Like all of Supergiant's other games, each track manages to be wonderfully composed, fit the scene perfectly, and work with the gameplay, and well, it's Daniel freaking Korb. Do I really need to explain this more? But it's not to say every track fits into a mold, as they weren't afraid to venture into strange styles of music for each team's individual themes. These are the standout instrumental tracks of the game, and all of them fit both to set the mood for the team, and also act as perfect battle music for the Rites. It's incredible how well crafted they are, that they work perfectly as both. But the real star of the show is what everyone knows from Supergiant: their vocal tracks. And the ones on display here with Never to Return and Bound Together are some of their best. Daniel Korb and Ashley Barrett come together once again with fantastic vocals, which need no further praise, as they speak for themselves. Both of these also have all the strengths of the instrumental music, now combined with absolutely beautiful lyrics that perfectly encapsulate both the feeling of the liberation rite and the ending of the game. Not to mention how the lyrics change based on what you do or who you fight in such fantastic ways. These two tracks are just so powerful and act as perfect emotional capstones for this game. But Supergiant never just slaps on fun visuals or a story and calls it a day. So let's see how they innovated in terms of gameplay with Pyre. Gameplay is actually the one critique many had with this game when it came out. Not for any flaws in the core gameplay, but instead just how strangely the game was structured. Some say it was misleading with what it shows versus how much actual time is dedicated to it. It's hard to explain without understanding the core loop of Pyre, so let's try to break that down. Pyre is one of those games that's hard to describe because it's a strange mix between a lot of things. But the easiest way I can split it up is that it's a narrative game where you get to know your team of exiles. You'll also do a bit of planning and strategy as you choose your paths, who to give more experience, and what bonuses and items to obtain in preparation for the Rites, which play out like some kind of strange sport. And this is where the problems start for some people. As while Pyre has excellent gameplay with the Rites, it's also a lot of reading, as the sections during your travels are more like a visual novel than anything else. And people weren't exactly thrilled about this, as the game doesn't really market this narrative aspect too much. While Supergiant has always had a big focus on their stories, they're usually told in brief or very visual ways. Pyre, on the other hand, feels like a novel at times, and that brings all the pros and cons with that. I personally think this balance works out in the end due to me caring about the story more, but also these sections give the player some breathing room between the Rites, not to mention their more important function of allowing the narrative and gameplay to harmonize, but we'll discuss that more in the next section. But the real meat of the game lies in the Rites, the thing that the game continues to build up as the one way to freedom, the last remnant of an old group who you follow in the footsteps of, an ancient sacred practice to find the worthy. And the gameplay of these Rites is basically NBA Jam. No, seriously, Pyre goes in a direction most wouldn't expect from such a moody world and atmosphere. It's actually a weird sports game seemingly inspired by basketball. The Rites have you pitting 3 of your exiles against another team of 3. You'll all fight over the sacred moon orb and try to get it into the enemy's pyre, which acts as their goal. You'll need to get it in here enough times to lower their flame, and you win. You have very simple controls here with a dash or run to get around enemies, a jump to leap towards the goal, and either throwing the ball or using a cast ability, which we'll discuss in a second. Now, this probably sounds quite simple on paper, and that is where you would be very, very, very wrong. Pyre throws in a few mechanics that manage to make this into something greater than a simple sports game, and adds so much depth and strategy. The two things that really make the Rites special are banishments and character abilities. Starting with banishments, this is basically the way to take control of the ball and fight back against your opponent. Unlike the sports it's based on, you don't just wait for a chance to block them. Instead, Pyre is much more aggressive with many ways to banish opponents and take them off the field for a while. These methods come in 2 forms, auras and casts. The aura is what each character has around them. Any opponent who steps into an opposing aura will be automatically banished. This is used for defense most of the time, with holding down parts of the field and crowd controlling. Meanwhile, on the offensive side, you have casts, where you basically shoot a streak of aura in order to try to banish opponents or to control how they move. But the catch with banishing is that all of those methods of offense and defense are completely gone once you take possession of the ball. With that orb, you become a sitting duck who can only move and throw it. It creates an interesting dichotomy between trying to get to the ball and clearing the field with auras and casts, and then having to focus more on pure movement in order to score it into the pyre. It makes a fascinating strategy that I haven't really seen before, and makes for incredible plays where you set up everything and then just have to rush the ball at the end. But even more depth gets added to this, as you have to consider the character classes and abilities. That wide array of races throughout the downside isn't there to just look cool or add lore, as each one of them has a unique moveset and a role within the Rites. Each is wildly different, from the all-rounder humans who also have a wilder variant, to the bulky demons who can tear through enemy lines, to the quick and agile curs and worms who can cut across the field, to the slam-dunking crones who may seem slow but can just leap across the field, to so many other options to throw into this. And that's not even mentioning the fact that each of them deals a different amount of damage and takes different times for banishment depending on their playstyle, which is something you also have to take in consideration for whether to use them for offense or defense. But you can only choose 3 of these to build your team out of, and that forces you to really consider the strategies you can play with them. Do you want pure offense with demons and humans to tear through the enemy lines before leaping into it for massive damage? Or do you want to trick them with quick movements to rack up lots of small hits with worms and curs? It's hard to make generalizations with just how many plays you can create with this wide roster of abilities. And even further, it forces you to change up these strategies, as in order to balance each game, once you score a goal, the player you scored that goal with is banished for that round. This not only gives the enemy team a greater chance to bounce back and score a goal, but it also forces you to consider your options with your 2 remaining players, and think more strategically. And it somehow still gets deeper with the strategy, as each play type has different branches with abilities to spec into. Worms could either be quick and speedy, or massacre the team with precise strikes, or crones can spec into their cast, or instead make sure they always have stamina. And this could open up even more plays depending on how you play with these various classes. All of this combined creates a game that is easy to understand, but there's so much depth and nuance to how many strategies go into each Rite, just like the sports it's based on. And the part that really helps this shine is the fact that, unlike other sports games, Pyre doesn't have a timer, and you don't simply fight to have more points. You fight till your Pyre goes out. Not only does this change up strategies even more, it also allows for each game to have more ways it can play out. You can utterly stomp them, but you can also have neck and neck races till the very end, or you can pull through when you're barely hanging on. It ends up making for much more memorable games than if these Rites could end in less climactic ways. And I haven't even mentioned just how smooth everything controls and how fast paced everything is, and just, God, these Rites are such a rush to play. There are a few more things that shake up the gameplay, which we'll get into in a bit, But overall, Pyre builds up an absolutely fantastic gameplay system with the Rites. And even if the gameplay loop overall may have a bit too much text for people, I think it's absolutely worth it for these great moments in the Rites. Plus, all that dialogue does build up something very special. So let's delve into the biggest reason I love Pyre: the story and characters. Supergiant is a studio that is known for the stories they tell. They're a studio that manages to get people deeply attached and feeling emotional with every single game they make. From the bittersweet story of Red and Transistor to the broken family of Hades, Supergiant has characters that stick with you, and Pyre is no different, and it stuck with me more than any of their other titles thanks to how they managed to intertwine it with the gameplay and you as a player. As explained before, the basic premise of Pyre is that you are an exile of the Commonwealth, a great civilization built up from the remnants of a fallen empire. But this civilization has grown to be a corrupt power, who now cast down any who break their overbearing laws to the harsh downside. But when you arrive, you meet with other exiles and you learn that your knowledge of reading allows you to partake in the Rites, an ancient path to freedom set by the previous founders of the Commonwealth. You follow in their footsteps to gain your freedom as you explore the downside, meet fellow exiles, and learn the story of the 8 scribes and the plans for the future. This premise excellently allows for you to explore this strange new world and learn the in-depth lore of the downside that is so excellently written. Out of all of Supergiant's worlds, Pyre is by far the most fleshed out and complex, with an intricate history to the scribes in the Commonwealth, strange customs and lands to learn, and of course the strange races of the world. And while this could easily end up as just a heavy lore dump, the game excellently delivers all of this not only through more clever dialogue and environmental telling, but also 2 excellent mechanics to teach the player all this knowledge. The first is the Book of the Scribes, which acts as a fun completion metric, as it encourages you to interact with the world in new ways. As you do more, it will begin to unlock more entries from the scribes that explain the world, triumvirates, and the Commonwealth. It's a fun reward for doing stuff if you enjoy the reading, and really does give character to these 8, but we'll discuss them more in a bit. The thing that really helps Pyre succeed story-wise in terms of getting the player quickly up to speed is the excellent definition system. Basically, every word in dialogue that is new or has a special meaning here is highlighted, and if you hover over it, it will give a quick definition to what it is to catch the player up. This instantly makes dialogue easy to follow, and you're always able to understand what people are talking about. It's really just a genius system I'm surprised more games haven't picked up on. And not to mention that Pyre, of course, uses it for more than just keeping the player up to speed, as these definitions will change as you go through the game, whether it be with your allies once freed, or characters as you learn more about them. These small touches really do complete the system and add so much to the dialogue. But the best lore in the world won't carry a game on its own, so it's a good thing Pyre has a one-of-a-kind cast with the Nightwings. The exiles you meet and bring into your team are the real meat of the game's story, as everything with the 8 scribes is really just a backdrop for their stories to flourish. Stories about broken people learning how to move past their problems with the help of those around them. Each of these 8 characters have something special to them, and the writing for all of them is just excellent. I shouldn't have to say that Supergiant is really great with their character writing and dialogue, but my god, do they go above and beyond once again for these guys. Each one of them has just such a strong personality that immediately gets your attention, from Jodariel's tough exterior to the moon-touched overall weirdness, to Volford being the shadiest of the bunch, to literally everything about Sir Gilman. From the get-go, they are all very entertaining to watch, and especially interact with each other, as all of the Nightwings have interesting chemistry with each other, whether it be Tizo and Moontouch's friendships, and the antics they get up to, or Jodariel trying to keep the peace between everyone, while also hating Pimantha's guts. Whenever more than one of them interact, it's a joy to watch. But these characters end up being much more than their initial impressions. Each Nightwing has something more going on with them, their own internal struggles and conflicts, to the secrets of their past that explain a lot more about them. All of them have more complex backstories that really do add to them in more ways than just explaining how they reached the downside. And you get to watch as they come to terms with those parts of themselves, find a resolution of some kind, whether positive or negative, and change for the future and their newfound friends. This bond with each character is made sure to be extra strong, as not only do you get chances to talk with them often, take certain paths for them, or other such things all the time, you also get attached to them through the gameplay, as each of them can be a key part of certain strategies and your reason for winning, as you specially upgrade all of them. It strengthens that bond as it gives you more reason to care for them not only as characters, but part of the gameplay. And the attachment is used against you hard when you reach the most powerful moment, and what cemented this game's narrative is my favorite: the liberation rites. Throughout the game, you are fighting to earn the freedom of one of your players, to fight your way back to the Commonwealth to live a good life, to reconnect with family, and to truly be free. And eventually, you finally reach the moment that someone might gain their freedom, climbing the highest mountain to where the scribes went, the end of the journey. It seems like it should be a joyous moment, till you remember that only someone can gain their freedom, and not everyone. It's far from the end of your journey as you realize that instead you'll need to start choosing who you want to go free first, and who you want to stay. It's a tough choice of wanting to free your favorites, but also knowing that freeing them means you will never get to see them again. You have to weigh whether they should have that freedom now, or if you want to spend more time with them and get through their arcs. It becomes an even harder choice when you factor in how these affect gameplay, as even a character you love could mean giving up a key part of your team for the rights. This is where the gameplay and story work hand in hand to make these hurt as much as possible. You can grow attached to characters because of how they help you in their rights, and that attachment makes you want to free them, but that also means having to give them up for the rights. And it suddenly becomes a very hard choice between your gameplay and your love for the character. And this hits even harder for characters who are attached to each other, as the game makes sure you feel the absence of the one you freed and the grief of the ones you've left behind. Each time you reach the liberation rite, prepare to be punched in the gut with this choice every time, as you weigh who deserves it, who you enjoy, who is helpful, and everything else before saying goodbye to a friend. And this gets used for even greater effect in the final liberation rite, where the game hits you with a choice that nearly broke me to consider. And as if all that wasn't enough to burn these scenes into my memory, the game makes it as grand of a farewell as it can, through not only a final speech from them, not only an incredible build-up with an amazing set piece, not only an exhilarating final rite against an enemy team giving it their all, but they also threw in one of the most powerful pieces of music with Never to Return, that hammers in how important this moment is and, well, the fact that you'll never see this exile again. These liberation rites make not only for incredible moments in their own right, but also form a solid backbone for an emotional story of freeing your exiles while knowing you may be left all alone. And even with how great this cast is and how invested you are in seeing them go free, the game's plot throws in a whole lot more on top of it, as you learn the stories of the 8 scribes and how they parallel your own group of exiles, and in the present you become part of something greater than just going back to the Commonwealth. And you learn of what happened to your predecessors, and why you're called the new Nightwings in an extra emotional plotline. As if all that wasn't enough, you have an even larger cast to get to know with enemy triumvirates whose leaders you will grow to hate, fear, or maybe even respect. Each of them has the same excellent writing and are an utter joy to watch on the screen, and your relationship with each will grow depending on who you free, whether you win or lose, or how much you fight against them. And that brings me to the final and most important aspect of Pyre's story: how it adapts to your choices in everything you do. While plenty of games pride themselves on changing based on your choices, Pyre does it in a way that feels very different, as it doesn't just change things based on a few moral choices that usually lead to the same place anyway. Instead, Pyre reacts to nearly everything you do, whether you want it to or not. because Pyre prides itself on not having a fail state. Whether you win or lose Rites, the game will continue on and simply adapt to that. That means you can lose to some triumvirants and they'll remember your loss. Or even bigger, you can lose a liberation rite and others will go free in your place. This makes for something where fascinating moments can happen without you even meaning to cause it, and that's one of my favorite things about this story, how much it feels like your own. Pyre builds up all these tiny moments on top of each other, how you interact with your fellow exiles, who you decide to free, who you fight against, who else might go free, and it builds a narrative around it that culminates in an ending that feels like it's all your own. Whether or not it's really that open, it gives the feeling that your story could have ended in a wildly different way, and it makes your experience with Pyre something insanely memorable. Pyre is truly a one-of-a-kind story that sticks with you and leaves you remembering every single detail. It's something truly fantastic. But let's finally wrap all this up. Supergiant is a company that has not produced a bad game in my opinion, and even if it was forgotten, Pyre continues this trend. It continues to truly innovate with unique ways to tie story and gameplay together to offer an experience unlike any other. It's a shame then that it doesn't get as much recognition as its siblings. But it has begun to amass a cult following. While nowhere near as loved as Bastion, Transistor, and Hades are, people do recognize the strengths of this game. While I wish I could say the success of Hades and Supergiant have helped this game take off, I sadly can't. No matter what, this seems to be the black sheep of Supergiant's catalog, and while it's a sad fate for such a fantastic game, it's fitting in a strange way. For a game all about exiles, being forgotten, and finding hope through the tiniest things, to end up with a fate like this, it's poetic. But I do still hope more people start to pick it up and recognize what Pyre does excellently. It's by far my favorite Supergiant game, easily surpassing Transistor and Hades. It forged a special connection with me, and I'll never forget that. I don't think I'll ever forget the downside. But that's all for this time. See you all in the next video, wherever that takes us.